Hello everyone, my name is Prabh Nair and I'm working as a chief instructor at infosec training.
Hello team, welcome to my session on Coffee with Prabh, and today we're going to discuss about the practical approach of risk management. When I was working on one of the project where they have given me a task, Prabh, we need to build risk management program in the organization, I was blank. I did a lot of research on YouTube, reviewed some documents, but I could not get a one particular resource which give me a concrete information about how to implement enterprise risk management from zero, from scratch. So I thought if I'm facing this issue, might be other practitioners or professionals are facing the same issue. So with that perspective, I thought let me make a video on this particular topic. Now, what is the best thing about this video? I'm not claiming to be a self-claim guy, but I can say one thing, I really put my 1.5 month of effort for this particular content. And this is basically part of my GRC series. In this content, we have taken the reference of content, theory and the practical templates, which I'm going to discuss step by steps. Exactly. This is not a theory based session. This is combination of the theory plus practical with the template, which give you a clear visibility how the enterprise risk management implement in the organization. So if you're new to the channel, do subscribe to the YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to make sure you should not miss my future videos on a similar topic, because I'm planning to make more and more practical videos on GRC, cybersecurity and network security and cloud. So without wasting a time, let's start with the first part. Thank you. Before going to start about risk management in detail, we should know the basics first, because until unless you don't know the basics, you cannot able to understand the risk management. So some basic terms are like example asset. Asset is anything which create value for an organization. And we have a two type of asset. One is called as a tangible and one is basically called as an intangible. So when we're talking about tangible asset, anything which is physical assets, intangible is anything which is a logical asset. Let's take example, we have a server. Server is a physical asset which can touch, but the data in the server is an intangible asset. Asset valuation is also two type. One is called as a qualitative and one is called as a quantitative. Qualitative is mapped with some reputation which cannot be measured easily, and quantitative is basically which is mapped with some monetary or numbers, like this asset has a $7,000 value, $8,000 value and all that. So that is how you basically categorize the assets. It's very important to know the value of the asset to perform the effective risk management, because impact of the risk is directly correlated with the value of asset. Second is basically called as a threat. Threat is an action that compromises the security. Okay, threat is an action which basically invade the security. Vulnerability is called as a weakness that we have in the system. Let's take an example. There is a hacker and there is a server. Hacker trying to do attack on the server, and that is only possible when there is a weakness, okay, in the server, and he discovered the weaknesses. Some ports are open, okay, some weak passwords are there, okay, inappropriate functions and everything, okay. So he used the opportunity, and by which he tried to exploit the server, and by which he gained access to server, and by which he gained access to the sensitive data, and that is basically the negative impact on the organization. It means some hacker hack into the system and there is a disclosure of a data, and company has to answer for that particular impact, and that lead to the overall risk. Okay, so summary is that hacker is a threat, vulnerability is called as a weak password, and risk is the overall impact which company basically face. One more example is ransomware attack. So there is a ransomware attack against the server. There's a ransomware attack against the server. So ransomware is a threat. They attack the server because they discover the weaknesses. There's no frequent backups is happening. So they encrypt the data, and now company unable to retrieve the data, company unable to decrypt the data. So that is a loss of an organization. That is basically called as a risk. So it is very important for us to know this basic terminology before moving to the next part. So I have one term here is enterprise asset affected by the threat source which create a threat event, and that exploiting a vulnerability, and that is basically result into the adverse impact. Okay, so let's move to the next part. So it is basically a risk which is there without implementing control. Example, we know there's 1,000 systems are there in the organization. Currently, we don't have any controls in that. We need to consider control, but we have this concern is how to implement the controls. It is difficult for us to manage that traffic because we're receiving a huge amount of traffic. Okay, so example, we're receiving right now 4 traffic. Okay, it is difficult for me to monitor. So something we have already accepted, there is an inherent risk, because if I miss one packet, it might have some exploit which have a further system. So currently there is no control for the risk. But now what happened, we installed some filtering solutions by which we can filter some of the traffic. So by this we can able to control only 2 and we left with other 2. So these 2 are called as a residual risk. So risk before implementing control is an inherent risk. Risk before untreated is called as an inherent risk, and risk after the treatment is called as a residual risk. Example, this is my inherent risk. We put a filter and after that we can able to limit to one particular traffic, and this is the thing which is left after implementing control, that become a residual risk. Okay, so that is another important term we have. Further to that, we also have a compensating control. The controls is basically introduced to reduce the impact. But we have this assumption control is introduced to reduce the impact, but primarily control is introduced to reduce the likelihood actually. How? Suppose this is my server. Okay, server 1 and server 2. So now what happened is, let's take an example of, there is an attack where it's sending 100 traffic, 100 packets. 1,000 packets. Here also we're sending 1,000 packets. Now, if in both server we don't have any control, so all the 100 servers, all the 100 packets are basically targeting directly on the server, which increase the load on the server while processing, and same applicable in the 2. Now what we did, we basically introduced the control, and this is basically called as a control we introduce. So by which what happened, we reduce the likelihood. When we reduce the likelihood of traffic, it basically also reduce the level of impact. Okay, so control is introduced to reduce the likelihood. Control, reduce likelihood. One more example, if my Gmail is only protected with the password, there is a higher chance that it can be exploited easily. But if Gmail is configured with the 2-factor authentication, the likelihood of performing the attack will be less. Okay, same with CAPTCHA also. Without CAPTCHA, there is a possibility of the bots. Multiple bots can be attempted. But if I enable the CAPTCHA, by which I can delay the bots, by which I can have a delay of the impact. So controls is primarily introduced to reduce the likelihood. Okay. Then the risk which is left after implementing control, that is called as a residual risk. And most of the cases, residual risk is the one we basically accept. Okay. So when we're going by the definition of risk management is a process of identifying, assessing and controlling the financial, legal, strategic and security risk in an organization, capital and earnings. So ultimate goal of the risk management is to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. So we have a dimension which is talked about in the organization, which is called as enterprise risk management. Okay. So see, right now my channel is primarily on the information security. So I'm talking about the information security, but we also have other dimension, and same applicable in the case of risk management. In risk management, we talk about information security risk management, and one risk management is basically called as an enterprise risk management. And this video is actually talk about enterprise risk management, which covered the information security risk management, it covered the financial risk management, it basically cover process risk assessment, and it also covers the regulatory risk management. So thin line difference between the ERM and ISRM is basically focused on the impact which map with CIA. It means if there is a data get hacked by the server, what is the impact? So impact is mapped with CIA. Whereas the enterprise risk management is talk about more holistic idea. If the server is basically down, the impact is basically on the customer, we might lose $7,000. So here the impact we're talking about more from the finance point of view. Impact we're talking about more from a business point of view. So enterprise risk management is a holistic approach which cover all kind of a risk management. Even the CISO in some companies report to CRO. So CRO, Chief Risk Officer, is responsible for the enterprise risk management, where the CISO is responsible for the information security risk management. Okay, so let's move to the next topic. So if you're planning to implement enterprise risk management in the organization, we basically follow this approach. Actually, this is a reference of COSO. COSO is a framework which talk about how to implement enterprise risk management in the organization. So I have taken a small view of this particular COSO, but I'm going to discuss more in detail about the practical aspects. Okay, so here you can see the first step is exercise the board and risk oversight. It is very important to form the committee, okay, because that is how we'll drive the risk management. Then second is we establish the operating structure, how we're going to work. Then we need to define the desired culture. What is the defined culture we have? And then we talk about the commitment value toward the risk. And all these things will publish in a enterprise risk management policy, like what is the value, what is the structure, operating structure. So it is very important. We need to create an enterprise risk management policy in the organization. How the policy look like? Let me show you that. So this is how the policy look like. If you can see in the policy, the first part where you define the purpose. Here you can add organization name. Suppose the purpose of the risk management policy is to communicate infosec train or aspirant technology commitment to managing the enterprise-wide risk. Then what is the scope of the policy? Like this policy apply to director, management staff of a infosec train or aspirant technology and committed to form the things. Then we talk about the key objectives we can add. Okay. Then we talk about review, when the policy need to be reviewed, what is the revision date, this policy will be accessible to whom. Then we describe the risk management process, like identify, analyze, mitigate. Here we need to document that. Then we talk about why we're doing a risk management, what are the principles we have, and then we explain the detailed process. So that's why everything which is part of a governance culture will be added in the policy. Then next important thing is called as a strategy objective, where we analyze the business context. Example, my business is basically doing the business of e-commerce. So availability is the most important thing. My business into healthcare, which is focused on the confidentiality. Then we define the risk appetite. In my further slide, we're going to discuss how to define risk appetite. Then we evaluate the strategy. We formulate the business objectives. And then we introduce a matrix, which is called identify risk, assess, prioritize, implement, and develop. This is more like an operational level. And then we try to review and revision, and then we communicate the overall culture to the people. So this is just a high level ERM, which is basically work, but don't worry, we're going to discuss each and everything in a different way, in a more practical term. So by end of the day, overall, if you see the risk management or enterprise risk management is divided into 4 activity only. First is establish the risk context. Second is conduct the risk assessment, which is on operational. And then third is called as a treatment of the risk. And finally, we have a monitoring risk. Okay. So first part we're going to discuss is the establish risk context. Okay. So next topic is called as establish risk context. So when you're talking about risk context, it's all about the behavior and attitude that you take of a risk from an organization point of view. It means what is your attitude toward the risk, what is your perspective toward the risk, what is your risk capacity, appetite. That is called as a risk context. So we have a 2 type of risk context, because it's very important to set the context. Okay, we have a 2 type of context. One is called external stakeholder and one is called as an internal context. So external context is basically mean what your perspective from a stakeholder point of view, you know, whatever the activity you are introducing, what will be the impact on the stakeholder with that particular activity. Like let's take example, so far we were using some datas and everything which is within a internal data centers and all that. Now we move to the cloud. So what is the perspective, what will be the context? Okay, we have from a customer point of view, can we go for that call? We have some customer from Middle East, they are very reluctant for the cloud. So that is my external context, which impacts my behavior, which impacts my decisions. So stakeholders are there. Okay, then we have a customers are there. We have a regulators, they have legislatures and business partners. So they have their own perspective about the organization, and we should not take any kind of an action which impact their decisions. Second is called as a internal context. Internal context is related to many of the factors like which is happening within the organization. So whenever you're establishing the risk management system in the organization, the first thing we need to set up the type of context. Once you have a type of context, we need to appoint some profiles. Okay, it's not necessary you need to appoint all these people, but when it comes to the big companies, okay, we have some major roles, which is basically part of the risk management. Like we have a cybersecurity officer. So when you take example of a cybersecurity officer, in some companies, it is also called as a CISO. Okay. They are the one who manage the risk management process for an information system. And these individuals may also act as a risk owner for any particular risk in register or risk manager designated by the risk owner who remain accountable for risk. Then we have an enterprise risk officer, a senior level person who accountable for managing and communicating a risk across the enterprise. And in some organization, this position is also called as a CRO. Then we have other C-suite members like CIO is there. Then we have a CISO, we have a CPO, Chief Privacy Officer, and Chief Financial Officer. Then we need some enterprise leaders. Enterprise leaders can be like you have the agencies or corporate officials, okay, who represent the various element of organizations, assist with managing and communicating risk throughout the enterprise. Then we also have an enterprise risk steering committee. They are the one who responsible for receiving a risk management information from throughout the enterprise, and they considering the overarching impact. Then we have an auditor, which providing the independent verification regarding the achievements of the enterprise objectives and the application of ERM process. And they are the one who regularly report the issues and everything. Then we have internal partners, we have external partners. So we need to list down all these particular roles. Okay. So once you have these roles, and you need to document that in your enterprise risk management policy. Okay, what are the roles we have, who basically carry the activity. So that's the most important thing. So once you basically organize all the roles in a procedure document, the next thing we need to build is the risk appetite and risk tolerance. So if you go by the statement, it's saying risk appetite is a statement that broadly describe the level of risk taking the management deem acceptable, and risk tolerance is narrowly defined as set the acceptable level of variation from performance goal intended to achieve the strategic objective. Okay, so if you really want to know in a very basic term, let me give you a best example. So the salary which I'm withdrawing every month, example, okay, the salary which I'm withdrawing every month is suppose $5,000. So this is the maximum investment I can do in a month. So this is basically my risk capacity. Actually, I decided to spend $1,000 from that in a mutual funds. So that is basically my risk appetite. Okay, that is basically my risk appetite. Now I can increase my appetite. Okay, I can increase my appetite based on the market conditions. So I understood in one particular month I want to increase a mutual fund range, and I went to 1,200. So here there is a $200 of increment I did in my appetite because I found that month the market is great. This is basically my risk tolerance. So risk tolerance is always a deviation. Okay, so one more example you can take. There is a state department. Okay, there's a state department of transportation. So they set the limit for its major highway. Okay, so this can be considered comparable to risk appetite. So it indicates that what the department executive believe is an appropriate balance between the traffic flow, highway and environmental wear and tear, and public safety. Okay, so most drivers, however, will travel at the speed somewhat higher or lower than the actual speed limit, rather than they obey the exact speed limit. So the point at which law enforcement start to the ticket speeder can be viewed as analogous to the risk tolerance. Okay, so the risk tolerance can be vary. So it's very important when you're creating a risk management policy and when you're creating a risk management system, it is very important to set the risk tolerance. So we have some examples here for the risk tolerance. Example, there is a global economic retail firm we have. So this is the risk appetite statement for them. Our customer associate reliability with our company performance, so service disruption must be minimized for any customer facing a website. So that is the appetite for them. Level of risk they are willing to accept. And they given the risk tolerance statement that country manager may permit website outage lasting for 8 hours for no more than 10% of its customer. Based on this only, we will go for the risk impact analysis. When you're calculating a risk, right, when you're providing a severity impact of the risk, during that time we consider this risk tolerance value. Okay, second example, we have a government agencies. So they have a risk appetite statement is mission critical system must be protected from known cybersecurity vulnerability. And we have set the risk tolerances system design as a mission critical must be patched against critical software vulnerability within the 14 days of discovery. So this is basically the tolerance we have. We can go above, but for that we need to take an approval. So when I'm doing a risk assessment, I discover some of the vulnerabilities which cannot be patched in 15 days. So here what happened, risk tolerance is increasing. So we need to see whether how far it exceeding above the appetite and how much it reaching the capacity. So based on that, we can take a decision like, okay, we need to treat this risk or not. Then third example, we have, suppose you are working in the enterprise healthcare provider. So you have setting the policy, setting the appetite is enterprise board director has determined that it has a low risk appetite for any cybersecurity risk caused by insufficient access control authentication mechanism. So we have set the risk tolerance here is there will be always be some device that do not yet support the advanced authentication, but 100% of the critical healthcare business application must use multi-factor authentication. This is the tolerance level we have set. So if I discovered any system without multi-factor authentication, that is a high risk. Then I need to see the moreover impact, right? So impact is basically that is a business application and it does not have a multi-factor authentication. So it is very important in the initial stage, set the tolerance. If you are involved in 7 business, understand the 7 business risk tolerance. And who will be the best person to tell you about this risk tolerance? The business owner. Now there is a e-commerce firm. For them, availability is a top priority. There is a banking services. For them, confidentiality, integrity is the primary priority. So understand their tolerance. Okay, so the one who running a e-commerce business say this, he's saying that okay, for a 10 minutes I'm okay to accept the downtime because every minute I'm earning dollars. Every minute I'm earning $1 million. So for them, risk tolerance is basically 10%. So according to that, when I'm doing my risk assessment, I identify the impact is basically going to this level, which is mapped with the tolerance or go beyond the tolerance. So that is why in the initial stage itself, we basically set the tolerance. We spend a good amount of time. We spend good amount of meetings, spend great amount of time on the meetings with the business owner to understand exact risk tolerance. Okay, so because they are the final one who can tell you the tolerance level or tolerance functions of the business. Okay, so it is very important for us to define. So once you have this particular tolerance and all that, based on that, you create a risk management strategy. So in a risk management strategy, you will explicitly specify the assumptions. You can define the constraints, risk tolerance, priorities. Okay. And your risk management strategies also include the strategic level decisions. Okay. So what will be the senior responsibilities? What is the responsibility of executives and how they're going to manage the risk in a day-to-day activity? So all these things part of the risk management strategy. So I want to show you one sample. So you get a better visibility how it works. So this is basically called as a activities which we need to document in the enterprise risk management strategy. You can see that the first thing we need a policy, then we need a strategy, then strategy based on that we adopt the framework, then based on that we document the risk. Okay, then we're creating a risk treatment plan. Then we have a risk assessment, risk status report, annual reports, integrate plannings documents, and finally we have a training. So all these things is basically part of the strategy. Okay, all are basically part of the strategy document. So it give you the high level idea about how things works and how activities has been implemented in the organization. Strategy is basically very important. So how are we setting the risk expectation? That's a question. See, setting a risk expectation priority is the most important thing. Okay, so what is the input? We need an input from the internal external context. We need a roles, we need a responsibilities, we need to know the frameworks. So this is something is the input we have. And what is the output? Like we are documenting the enterprise priorities about the mission objectives. We need to know the stakeholder values from budget point of view. We need a risk appetite statement. Okay, we need a discipline functions and everything. So here, after understanding a context, we able to creating appetite. And then once you have an appetite, you're going to interpret the risk appetite to define the risk tolerance statement. Okay, so $1,000 is my budget for mutual funds. So what is the tolerance, below or above? So enterprise priorities in light of a mission, objective, stakeholders. Okay, risk appetite statement we build. So that is the input. And based on that, we create the complete risk tolerance statement and risk policy. So that is something is basically most important. So we need to collect all the documents, Okay, and based on that, we create a policy, we create appetite, and based on the appetite, we basically creating a risk tolerance statement and risk policy. Okay, so that is what we need. Now, there's always a question arise about how to set a risk thresholds, okay, how to determine the tolerable range. So I have one formula for that, which I follow for my project. Okay, let me show you that. Okay, so this is the formula which I used when I'm basically setting a risk tolerance. So here you can see risk sensitivity low. So in that case, risk tolerance is basically negligible high and risk threshold is basically high. What is the meaning? See, if I am running a startup example, okay, I don't have anything to lose. I'm in a business where I want to earn customers. I want to build competitions. I want to buy more business. So in that case, I will take more risk. So in that case, my risk tolerance will be high because I don't have anything to lose. But company like Big Four or another banking things and all that, recently SVB and all that, even they basically take a minor decision, they have a big impact. So in that case, in their perspective, their risk tolerance are basically low because they know very well if they go for any risk for any activity, they'll have a big impact. So think of a risk threshold as a highest level of acceptable risk exposure for the resources. So if you remember, we stated that risk threshold is always inversely proportional to the risk sensitivity level. So if you have a high sensitivity to risk, I repeat, if you have a high sensitivity to risk, then you should have a low threshold for the risk. Okay, so resource with the low sensitive to risk will have a higher threshold for the risk exposure. So risk threshold is the upper bound for the risk tolerable range, and risk tolerance range define the lowest and highest level of acceptable risk for the resources. Okay, that's the most important thing. So if you have a high sensitivity to risk, then you should have a lower threshold, and resource with a low sensitivity of the risk or low sensitive risk, then we have a high threshold. So risk tolerance is basically driven by that factor only. So here we can see risk sensitivity is basically low, risk tolerance negligible. No, we have a high. Okay, we can take high risk tolerance because the data is no, and risk threshold we have set is high. But in the case of high risk sensitivity, in that tolerance will be low. So risk threshold is also low. How? Let me give you an example. This is basically my server. Okay, that server is basically support this business process. This business process every second generating a good amount of dollars for me. For me, in this case, the risk sensitivity is basically high. So in that case, my risk tolerance is basically low. So anything happen, even for a second, I cannot bear it. So I will understand the business management requirement. I understand senior management requirement to understand how critical is a business process. So according to that, I will set the thing. So in this case, if any attack happen, like there is a virus, and virus is a threat, it basically attack the server. And if server is basically down, even for a 1 minute, the impact is basically high because risk sensitivity high, and threshold is basically very low for them. So according to that, we need to prepare the things, we need to mitigate the risk. So that is how, based on the tolerance and based on the beyond the appetite, we'll take an action. So once you have all these things, then you formulate and create a policy. See, policy is the first thing you create. Okay, in which you define the policy statement. This risk management is applicable for which particular area. Okay, what is the reason of policy? Define the role, and then we define the risk management process. So all these things is basically part of the policy. When I started a session, I already shown you how the policy look like. Okay, so your strategy further to that include the policy. Okay, so first we create a strategy, then we create a policy. Okay, because policy set the expectation. Policy is you can say governance. It's a foundation for a risk management governance. Okay, and policy is a part of a strategy. Now we are moving on the operation level where we are conducting a risk assessment. Now let me show you the Excel sheet. So this is the sample Excel sheet which I have created, okay, for my organization. So here you can see in the first part of the sheet, we need to mention about the company details like company name, company background, what is the company goal, regulations, client, employee count, do we have any functions, like here we have business development engineering, what is the business offering, contracts, outsourcing do we have, what kind of vertical in the market, we are into all. Okay, any threats? Definitely we have. what is the risk tolerance? Moving forward into the year, looking at reduction of risk to stabilize the internal process and technology. That is basically my risk tolerance. What are the public IPs we have? Web domain. What is the critical business system? CRM, meeting app. So this is something is my first step, which is basically called as a discovery, where I want to discover the information about the organization. Then on the next tab, I will document the legal regulatory requirement. Suppose infosec, aspirant technology, they are basically doing a business in US, they're doing a business in UK. So when they're working in these respective countries, okay, they have to abide with legal regulatory requirements. So in this case, I have to see, okay, how my company is going to be impacted by the regulation. So example, like I'm operating my services in US, example. Okay, so I need to be comply with FISMA. Okay, I need to be comply with the FISMA, and FISMA also have a requirement that you must do risk assessment. So I'm not doing a risk assessment to check what is the level of compliance we need to follow, but as a company, it is mandatory for me to have a regulatory requirement, risk assessment requirement in the organization. So FISMA say you need to risk assessment. You can see it is clearly mentioned here. This memorandum or circular reinforce the tenet that federal agency should have a continuous assessment of a risk. So it is a regulatory requirement. You must do risk assessment in the organization. Now, as I said, I want to comply with GLBA. GLBA also state conduct the risk assessment according to section 314.4. Then if I'm operating my services more in the healthcare, I need to comply with HIPAA. HIPAA has their own requirement of conducting a risk assessment. Okay, then if I go for GDPR, they have Article 32 talk about you need to measure the security controls. PCDSS has a 12.2 requirement. You need to have an annual formal risk assessment. And ISO 27001 itself basically saying that you need to have a requirement of 6.1.2, which is called information security risk assessment. So this is also risk assessment is sometimes it's not about the business requirement, but it basically come from a legal and regulatory requirement. Okay, that's the most important thing. So once you basically create a policy strategy, now we have to start our action, how to conduct risk assessment. Okay, so when you're doing a risk assessment basically have 3 steps. One is identification of the risk, second is analysis of the risk, and third is called as a risk evaluation. Okay, so this is just an example, mentioned in this PPT, the risk ID, the priority, description, category, what is the likelihood, impact, exposure rating, control type. So we're going to discuss each and every step in detail. So we're going to start with the first part, which is called as a risk identification. So when we're talking about risk identification, the first step is we need to know the value of assets. We need to know the inventory of assets. Because when you're doing a risk assessment, until unless you don't know what asset we have, against what you're going to do risk assessment. So for risk assessment, the first thing we need to understand the inventory and valuation of asset. Okay, so I want to show you my Excel sheet in which you get the information about the inventories. So here you can see I have a CRM process, and the affected unit is sales. The process owner is Lisa. The name of the asset is CRM application. Okay, the description of asset has been given, like it is a solution capture leads. The type of information we're capturing is digital. Does it capturing personal data? Yes, we're capturing email ID. Does it having a personal sensitive data? Yes, because we sometimes capturing address. Are we capturing sensitive customer data? Yes. So according to the company's classification process, it is strictly confidential. Okay, confidential level, impact is basically high, integrity high, availability is basically medium, because for us, we need to protect this information from disclosure. We also give the information about who is the custodian, like in our team, we have a RD, and data retention period is subject to the business requirement. Okay, so this is how we have maintained the inventory of assets. Now here you can see, once you have an inventory of assets, we identify the value of assets. Value is 2 types, qualitative and quantitative. Okay, then it is not possible for us to give attention to all the assets. So based on the value, we drive the BIA. BIA is all about what is important, what is not important. So that is called as a business impact analysis. Because if you have a 5,000 assets and you want to do risk assessment of 5,000 assets, it is not possible on the same time you can do that. So you will do BIA to identify from 5,000 which process is basically important, which process is basically critical. Okay, because it is not possible in one go I can do risk assessment against the 5,000 applications. So we do the BIA to identify which one is critical, which one is not. So with the help of BIA, I'm going to pen down all the potential threats. Okay, I need to pen down all the potential threats. I need to extract all the threats. And then I need to identify the vulnerabilities which is associated with the asset. So I need to pen down, I need to obtain the list of vulnerability data. Okay, so question is how to further categorize the assets. So here we have a few category of our assets or resources, like application is there. Okay, infrastructure is there. Okay, environment is there, facility is there, business unit is there, vendors is there. Okay, so when you focus first is going to be depend on your organization industry. So when you focus first is going to depend on your organization industry. When you focus first is going to depend upon your regulatory. So example, like if you are a internet service provider, you might start by profiling your infrastructure, okay, such as network devices, DNS server, and so on. But if you're application service provider, you would like to start with the application that you host. Similarly, the organization that make heavy use of offshore developers might focus on their vendor profiling first. So understand the business you are in will help to guide your priorities. You don't need to address all this area right out on the gate. Pick your battles accordingly. Okay, so that's the most important thing. So when you focus first, going to depend upon your organization industry. That's the most important thing we have. And sorry for correction, it is vendor. Okay, so here we have example, like we have to capture the details in this order, like resource owner, okay, business units, resource custodian, environment. I have used the same thing but more in detail. I mentioned the asset custodian, I mentioned the type of information I'm capturing, and what is the name of assets. So this is the sample asset profile we create. Okay, general description of asset, okay, function and feature, what the asset is basically offer, what is the classification of information, what is the criticality, and that information, does it applicable in any regulations. So as I said, another way to think about risk sensitivity is a measurement of the resource tolerance for risk, and it identify an acceptable range of risk exposure for that resources, because risk exposure we have to identify in the asset profile. Okay, now once you basically have assets in detail, okay, then we need to identify the threats and vulnerabilities, which we already discussed, like enterprise affected by the threat source which exploiting a vulnerability, and that result into the adverse impact. So question is how to identify the threat source. So we have a different type of threat source. Example, like we have a individual's threat source, example like employee, contractor, customer, client service provider. Okay, hackers, these are the example of individual. Then we have external organizations like activists, criminal individuals, terrorists, and all that. Then we have some technical event which can be a threat for us, organized crimes and all that. Then we have accidental crime where the employee click on some links and all that. Okay, then we have a natural events like floods and everything. So it is very important to pen down the possible threats. My suggestion is that first identify the vulnerabilities and then identify what are the threats against the vulnerability. Is it clear? That's the most important thing. So let's take example. We have a server. Server is basically connected on the internet. So, and we have discovered server 23 port is open. So that is also a functional port, but also there is a weakness that, okay, anyone from that particular port can able to connect with the server. Okay, so if there is no threat against that vulnerability, there's no need to patch that. So it's your call. First pen down the possible threats, or first identify the vulnerabilities and then identify the threats. So all these things we have to do in the identification stage. So this is all the activity. So next we move to the next part, which is called as a risk analysis. Okay, so next thing is basically we have a qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. See, we identify asset, we identify threats, and we also identify vulnerability. And now we are in a position that, okay, if the threat is going to exploit the vulnerability, what is the impact on the asset? Impact mean what is the overall impact? What is the level of impact? That we need to calculate. We know there is a hacker is going to hack the server, and by which he can able to gain access to the data. But if he able to access to that data, okay, what will be the impact on the organization? Like, the organization is answerable to regulatory authority. There is a cost involved in that. Organizations suffer the business loss because of the disclosure of a data. It impact the reputation. So all these analysis we need to perform. So we have a two way to analyze this impact. One is called as a qualitative analysis, where we just rank the risk into high, low, and medium. And the second one is basically called as a quantitative analysis, where we are using a numerical value. One thing you need to understand, if you have a limited time and you need to go for a high level assessment and all that, then we can go for a qualitative analysis. But where the numbers are involved, okay, calculations are there, it takes time, but it is a more accurate, that is called as a quantitative analysis. So qualitative is high level, fast. Quantitative is basically slow. Definitely qualitative is basically more like a hypothetical scenario kind of a thing, whereas a quantitative is most accurate. So when you have a historical data, it is easy for us to perform the quantitative analysis. And when we don't have a historical data, we just need to do the high level analysis, we go for the qualitative analysis. I have seen some organizations where they start with the quantitative and then they go with the qualitative. I have seen that such kind of an organization also. So I'm going to explain the practical of the quantitative, but first qualitative. First we discuss about the quantitative analysis from the theoretical perspective. So in the quantitative, we basically follow this formula: asset value, exposure factor, SLE, ARO, ALE. Okay, so these are the parameters we have that we using for a quantitative risk analysis. So in the quantitative risk analysis, the first thing we need to use the SLE. SLE basically stands for single loss expectancy, and how we calculate with the help of asset value and exposure factor. Exposure factor is called as a percentage of the asset loss. Example, there is a virus and there is a server. Okay, now server basically having an asset value is suppose $10,000. If virus basically attack on the server one time, if one time virus attack on the server, okay, server will be down. Okay, but the question is, if server is basically down, what is the impact that we need to calculate? So formula is basically SLE into asset value into exposure factor. So here the asset value is $10,000. I'm assuming if server is down, it will basically down for everything, we keeping 100%. Let's take an example. Okay, so it will be coming around, overall SLE loss for me is $10,000. See, when we work in the production, we always take exposure factor as 100% only, because we cannot assume. So exposure factor is all about percentage of loss. Now we assuming that, okay, if one time server is down, even for 1 hour, the asset value reduced to $8,000. Okay, so formula then will be SLE, asset value is $10,000. Okay, exposure factor of 8,000 of 10 is 80%, because we always give in a percentage. So it will be coming around SLE is $8,000. So single loss cost me $8,000. Now based on the single loss expectancy $8,000, I'm not going to invest the antivirus, because antivirus coming around cost is $12,000. So I'm not going to invest $12,000 to protect my $8,000 loss. So that is why we never take a call based on SLE. We always take a call based on a ALE. So in the ALE, the formula is SLE into ARO. Now SLE basically is $8,000, and this virus basically attacks suppose 6 times in a year. So it will be coming around $48,000. Now it makes sense to spend $12,000 to save $48,000. Okay, but one more important thing, when we're talking about the control, okay, we need to give a justification of the value of control also. So formula for that is ALE before implementing control. Suppose in this case, the cost is coming around $48,000 minus after installing the antivirus, it is reduced to suppose $3,000. Okay, minus cost of antivirus is $8,000. Whatever the value left, that is the value of the safeguard. Clear? So 48 minus 840, so $37,000 is the value we have achieved from this particular control cost. Okay, so that is how you can able to measure the value of the safeguard, but that you can get only after a year. So this is basically more like a quantitative way of analyzing a risk. Okay, now we have a qualitative way of analyzing a risk. So in this way, we are basically using two factors. What is the likelihood and what is the impact? So when I say definition of a likelihood, Likelihood is all about the estimate of the probability of risk occurring, okay, in a given period. So that is basically called as a likelihood. And impact, if it's happened, what is the impact? Example, like there is a server, okay, against the server we have a monthly attacks. So threat is going to exploit the vulnerability every month. So that's the likelihood. If it happen, the impact is $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. Understood? So, and then we map this impact with the risk tolerance, and from there we get the overall risk severity settings, whether it is high, low, and medium. So here you can see almost certain, like 5 monthly occurrence. So we give the rating 5. Likely is there, we give monthly has occurred in 6 months, so we give the rating 4. Possible is basically 3. Okay. Then we can see here unlikely happen at 2, and rare is basically 1. Where the impact is all about the impact in the case of realization of risk. So here you can see the high is basically 6 to 9. It means there is a virus occurs every month, and the impact is basically disclosure of a data, and because of that there is a loss of confidence and there is a regulatory penalty we need to pay. So impact is basically high, so we give the rating between 6 to 9. Virus attack, it impact the normal operation, so medium impact is there to 3 to 6. Acceptable level of risk within a tolerance level, we give the low. So this is how we basically measure. So I have another attribute that I'm using for the likelihood impact. Here you can see. Now if you can see here, this is another example we have. If you can see negligible, unlikely ever to occur. Very low, likely to occur 2 or 3 times every year, every 5 years. Low is basically likely to occur once every year. Medium is likely to occur once every 6 months or less. High is likely to occur once per month. Very high is likely to occur multiple times per month. And extreme is basically likely to occur multiple times per day. So it depends upon your risk tolerance and your nature of business. And impact is also depending upon what kind of a business you have. Like, you are into e-commerce, for you availability is the biggest thing. So if this is attack happen, the server will be down, it has a big impact. So we give the rating for that impact is 5. So here insignificant, basically little, no impact. Minor mean minimal effort, significant is small but tangible, damaging is damage to the reputation, serious and critical. I will give one more example so you get a better visibility. So here you can see another way we have calculated the likelihood is this one. See, sometimes what happens, risk impact is mapped with CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Here you can see we have a server. Okay, it basically stores the PI data. We have a server which basically store the PHI data. If hacker, okay, hack into server, there is a disclosure of PI and PHI. Okay, under 5 records of confidential data is exposed. So impact is minor, but more than 15 records are disclosed, the impact is basically critical. In this case, availability is 0 because there is no accessibility we have. Okay, integrity matters. So it is not necessary every asset we only consider from the confidentiality point of view. Okay, now we have another server which basically providing us services on the internet to the customer. Okay, for me, if it's basically down for 1 hour, it has a big impact. If it's down for 2 hours, big impact. If it's down for 5 hours, it exceeds my risk tolerance. So we give the critical rating. So there's no data, so I cannot measure from a confidentiality point of view. So in this case, confidentiality, I will give cross, but availability, I will make high. Integrity, I will mention high. So sometimes impact is organized based on a CIA. Now here you can see more than 10 record were compromised, more than 10 transactions got modified, several customer facing offline for a week. So here the impact is basically varies from CIA tried. So this is the example we have taken. The threat action, there is an internal user unauthorized interception of a data. What is a vulnerability? We have discovered the lack of encryption during a transmission of data. Now question is, what is the likelihood of this threat action is going to exploit the vulnerability? Chances are 2. And this has happened, the impact score we have given is 5 because it basically disclosing a PI data. So 5 into 2, 10, the classification we have given the moderate. It is just an example I'm giving. Now, if I go back to the same Excel sheet, here you can see the Excel sheet. So we have categorized same thing here in the frequency matrix. So if you notice the frequency matrix, okay, frequency matrix is basically occurrence. So we have given the value is called 5 is rare, 4 is likely, okay, 3 is possible, okay, 2 is unlikely, rare. Okay, based on a tolerance. And this is basically impact matrix. But if you see the impact matrix, we have a different type of impact matrix. Like we have a confidentiality impact matrix. Okay, here you can see description is very low, but very high. In that case, the confidential data is regulated and trade secret. If regulated and trade secret data is basically compromised, business is critical is high and impact is also high. Now, sometimes we basically based on availability, vacancy here, based on integrity we have. And this is how sometimes we don't have a CIA. So we give the impact based on a regulatory. Okay, we can give the impact based on regulatory, human, financial, reputation. So it depends. Okay, how you basically define the thing. So in this case, you can see there is a threat which is called virus, basically attack the server. Okay, so there is a virus which basically attack the server. And server is basically down. Because of the confidential data, we need to answer to regulatory authority. Regulatory has a big impact. So here we given the very low is minor, but very high because it might go out of business. Now same we have a physical safety. For that we're doing a risk assessment. We discovered that suppression systems are basically unavailable. Minor injury very low, but major injury is basically death. So we know if suppression system is expired, we need to replace that because impact is death. Okay, so sometime the impact is based on a CIA or sometime is based on these 4 dimensions: regulatory, human, financial, and reputation. So it is up to your business how you define. Here we are organizing a different type of risk category. Okay, compliance risk, customer safety, financial risk, hazard, human capital risk, operations, reputation, strategy risk, and technology. So that is how we have. And then finally, we creating this risk summary report where we're giving a category of risk. Suppose we have taken the example of my HRMS. So category of risk, we have discovered regulation. We have to give a risk ID because risk register will maintain that information. So category of risk is regulation. Affected business unit is HRMS. Risk ID we have given is 8901 because that value goes to the common risk register. We have to explain our story. And it should be explained in such a manner that it can be understandable to the person. During the assessment, we have discussed admin password were not configured in a secure manner, which can lead to the access in authorized manner. HRMS application is accessible from internet. We also discovered it is not protected by the firewall. So we just observing what we did, what we have seen. And vulnerability, we have discovered there is a weak password. Okay, existing control, I could not find effective. There was a control, but it was not effective. Okay. Recommendation is control passwords. Make sure application should be protected from the firewall. Now likelihood of this HRMS going to be exploited, likelihood I give the possible. Okay, and impact is basically high. The reason why the HRMS basically store the employee data. That's why the risk rating I given the medium. Now from where I got this value? Because I'm sure this is a question. So this is how the matrix we create. So if the value, suppose we have a value called likely and the impact I basically mention high. So in that case, the risk rating will be critical. If I say the impact is basically possible, okay, sorry, probability is basically possible and impact is basically severe. Okay. And from where I get this value based on a CIA, regulatory, reputation and all that. So I will basically give the value risk rating here. Current risk status is mitigated. Who mitigate? It will be by Lisa. Current status is basically close. So this is how we basically give the value. Okay, coming back to the slide. When we're talking about the treatment, we have a 4 type of treatment. Accept the risk, transfer the risk, mitigate the risk, and avoid the risk. So we accept the risk in that case when the risk is below the appetite, okay, below the tolerance level, or the cost of opportunity is higher than cost of risk. Cost of control is higher than the cost of risk. We know it doesn't make sense to implement the control. So in that case, we accept the risk. Okay, second is we transfer the risk. We transfer the risk to third party. We basically transfer the risk in that case when likelihood is low, but impact is high. We know by the cyber insurance, we can buy the risk. Third is we basically mitigate the risk by implementing a control. And after the risk which is left, normally we go to accept. And last is basically called as a risk avoidance. Risk avoidance basically means we avoiding the opportunity, we avoiding a source which bring risk to the organization. Okay. So example like discontinuing one application, not giving CISSP exam is like avoidance of risk. Okay. So avoidance risk may be the business call, but acceptance risk is basically the IT call. Okay. That's the most important thing. So when we documenting everything, we are creating a risk register in which we maintain a risk ID. Okay. So this is suppose risk ID 1 I given. So if you take a reference of the Excel sheet, This is basically called as a risk ID. So risk ID is basically suppose 8904. Risk title is regulation. Scope is basically HRMS. Then we explaining about risk impact and what is the treatment we have suggested. When we talking about the results, okay, in the result we consider different kind of a data. Okay, so we need to have first data collection document request list. Like example, like we need to have, when you presenting the reports finding to the management, okay, we need to have some set of documentations. So in the data collection, the first part we need to have is records of interview, asset inventories, asset listings, what the assessment you did, right? Then contact list. Then we have a data analysis. It means the issues, observations, okay, threat catalog, vulnerability catalog, control analysis, risk score. Then risk analysis, basically all about your risk categorization metrics, and finally report. So these are the documents you have to maintain. When you're preparing a report, there is a most important thing is that when you need to present risk to the senior management or a client, it is critical to articulate the risk accurately. So when you basically presenting something, okay, suppose finding and all that, one thing we need to understand, when you narrate the finding, ask yourself, would this organization lose its client? Would they go out of business if we don't mitigate this? Would they have to notify all the customer about the unauthorized disclosure, and could they recover from a breach? Okay. So if your risk description does not answer these questions, then you have not fully covered the component of a risk. How? Let me give an example. See, as a result of one or more defined cause, uncertain event may cause, which would lead to one or more effect on the resource. This is the template we have. Okay. So I have given the reference as a result of unauthorized access sensitive data. So this statement I have basically used as a overall outcome. As a result of the unauthorized access sensitive data, unauthorized disclosure of PI data for all customer may occur, which is called as an event. Okay, which would require the breach notification to regulatory affected client. So it means we need to notify the regulators. So it is easy to confuse the threat and vulnerability with the risk itself. Okay, but think of a risk as a description of the consequences. What would happen if the vulnerability were exploited? Remember, risk detail the impact to the organization. So your statement, your value of clear and concise communication cannot be overstated in the risk management. Okay, so no matter how accurate your risk model or how thoroughly your threat analysis, it will be definitely meaningless if you can't effectively present to the business. So this is basically template. Do let me know how do you find my video, and do let me know what is the next video you want me to make on governance. I already made some of the videos on governance. This is the third part of my governance series, where I receive a lot of requests for make a concept of how to do the risk assessment. So this is how we do risk assessment in the organization. Trust me, I did a lot of hard work for this particular content, and if you find this content useful, do share your comments in a comment box. Do share your feelings. Do share your feedback in the comment box. I will be waiting for the feedback. Okay. And still, if you're not subscribed to the channel, do subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to make sure you should not miss my future videos on a similar topic. Thank you. Bye.